Everyone knows that after the Dreamcast's death in the early 2000s, Sega started to develop software for third parties. As such, multiple enhanced ports of their Dreamcast games were released, which include Sonic Adventure DX and Sonic Adventure 2 Battle for the GameCube and PC. While SADX has the same blueprint and core as the original Sonic Adventure for the Dreamcast, it turned out to be very different in basically everything else, especially graphically. With that being said, the differences between the multiple versions of its predecessor overshadowed the ones between Sonic Adventure 2 on the Dreamcast and Sonic Adventure 2 Battle on the GameCube. However, while the latter two really are less different between each other when compared to SA1 and SADX, the ports still contain a lot of changes that were either made on purpose or a product of the GameCube's hardware capabilities. And while a lot of people aren't really aware of the huge differences between SA1 and SADX, you can imagine that even less know of the ones in the sequel ports. Given this, today I'll probably ruin your mental image of the game forever, as I'll be showing you basically every single difference, be it massive or minor, between the Dreamcast and GameCube versions of Sonic Adventure 2. All the credits of what I'm gonna be covering today go especially to the very comprehensive The Cutting Room Floor page on this, Greenalink's 3-hour-long video also about this, as well as Peep's Highways video comparing the cutscenes between the versions, which were all very useful, so you should definitely check them out. Also, a big thanks to everyone whose names are on screen now, who contributed with research, documentation, footage and mods, as well as Austin SV for the idea, specifically his videos on the Persona series, which are how I found out about them and that you should also check out if it interests you. So let's dive into this huge rabbit hole of Sonic Adventure 2 differences. For the people who watched my SA1 video on this matter, you might be expecting to, once again, hear a very detailed and technical explanation on the general differences between the versions, be it lighting, transparency, texture quality, whatever. The thing is, and as I've mentioned before, SA2 on the Dreamcast and SA2 Battle on the GameCube are not as different as those two games are, even if there might be huge differences or downgrades between them anyways. The issues that do exist are mostly due to the same reasons as SA1, specifically transparency and texture quality degradation, which I will get into in a bit. With that being said, I'll be focusing on comparing direct differences between both versions, and even if there's more technical stuff to be said, you shouldn't really worry about it if you don't get it, as you can easily visualize the differences anyways. I won't be covering all of them, but most definitely. Also, if you notice any error on my explanation or anything else, please feel free to correct me in the comments. Sorry if I sound a little sick too, I'm recovering from a cold, so I'm not at 100% yet, but it will get better throughout the video since I won't be recording it all on the same day. Since there's a lot of stuff to cover, it's better to start at a broader scale and then start diving into more specific details, like level design changes. As such, let's start by taking a look at general differences, firstly going over the menus. The Dreamcast version doesn't feature the iconic opening with Sonic and Shadow at Radical Highway before the title screen, instead having a small clip of the game's logo popping up in space. While Battle still has this sequence in its files, it looks very broken. The title screens are completely different. Besides the logos not being the same, the GameCube version has a scrolling background of the game's main characters featuring other effects, while the Dreamcast is completely static. After you press start, you get sent into the main menu. Sonic Adventure 2 in various fonts can be seen scrolling in the background in the original version, while Battle retains the orb effect from the title screen. Other differences in this menu include 2P Play being renamed to 2P Battle, the homepage option being removed, and the GameCube version using a different background featuring all characters for each menu, while the Dreamcast uses art of Sonic and Shadow's faces under different sets of colors. The options menu also has a few differences. The sound test is located here in the original, while in the ports it was moved to the extras menu replacing the download events option, and in the options menu it was replaced with the option to delete multiplayer records. The icon for changing between mono and stereo sound is different, as are the ones for the rumble setting and memory cards, and the TV settings menu was removed. The character menu themes were revamped for Battle, featuring new backgrounds with renders instead of 2D artwork. While these were unlockable via download in the Dreamcast, the GameCube has 6 unlocked by default and the other ones can be bought via the Chao Black Market. Since the icons of the themes weren't changed, the ports are using renders of the original models. Another area of Sonic Adventure 2 that suffered a lot of changes were its graphics. Not all of these changes are downgrades, rather just a different flavor of the same thing, but there's still a considerable amount of them that could have perhaps been executed better to retain the feel of the original. Even so, there's a lot of stuff that has been made more decorative and detailed compared to the original, which are inarguable improvements. difference. The lighting on every character and object is different in the GameCube version. While this difference may range from completely unnoticeable to really jarring, the difference is there and happens due to the shaders used in the original game not being present in battle, which makes the object lighting look slightly bland in comparison. The character models also have very slight differences. In general, they're more detailed and rounder as a result of having a higher poly count, as well as their shadow better reflecting their actual shape, though it looks blurrier. Even so, these shadows don't seem to be cast onto the actual models themselves, whereas in the original version their body features clearly obscure some other parts of the model, which makes the battle models feel a bit dull and out of place in certain areas, as well as it just being weird that their floor shadow goes through them without hitting anything else. Additionally, there are one or two other minor tweaks made to each model. Sonic's eyes are a bit bigger and he's less pointy overall, with his ears and spikes being smoother and more curved than the Dreamcast version. There's also considerable detail upgrade on his torso and mouth, which are a bit rounder too. Tails' legs now stand closer together, with his arms also having a slightly different positioning. Knuckles looks a bit less angry due to his eyes being a bit more open, and his tail now has a nice smooth curve instead of the jagged path of the original. Eggman's legs have a shiny effect in battle as to better display the material of his clothing, and his shadow is now actually accurate instead of being made up of one big ball and two smaller ones. Shadow's eye positioning is now closer to the center of his head, which makes him look a bit angrier, and the angle of his hands, specifically the thumbs, is different. His ears also had a slanted pointy end, which was smoothed out in battle. As for Rouge, her eyelids gained a glossy look, which still makes them stand out compared to the brighter eyes. In the original, the first cast a shadow onto the latter, which gives them that darker look. The pignails upgrade has a different model, now only going up to the ball of the foot instead of all the way to the tip of the toes, and they now have a nice shiny environment mapping effect. Her wings also have a different, more detailed model with new textures. As for Tails' mech walker, the only real difference is the two tails emblem on his right leg, which is mirrored. And lastly, Eggman's mech walker has a different front torch when wearing the armor upgrades. On the same note, he now has a flashlight effect that lights up anything in front of him, being helpful specifically in Lost Colony, which was a really hard stage to navigate in the original game due to being so dark. His lock-on missile cannon has an octagon shape in battle as opposed to the diamond shape of the original, and the base model, without the armor upgrade, has also seen the E-System branding removed in battle. The higher polygon count and detail are objective improvements, however how they look is a matter of personal preference. Even so, it's undeniable that these quote-unquote improvements are traded in place of worse lighting and shading, as well as other issues having to do with transparencies and such. Additionally, these new models also lose specific animations in cutscenes, like Sonic's ear twitching when he notices Shadow for the first time, but we'll take a deeper look into that in a bit. On the same note, some enemies also have differences in their design. The shield hunters had their shields redesigned in battle, now being narrower and more revealing compared to the original, where they were made to cover up a little bit more of the robots. There's also a O1 shield variant in the Dreamcast that was removed in the ports. The Beetle robots have a gun logo on their supposed foreheads in the original version, while in battle it doesn't show up due to a layering issue, which is actually what happens with that E-System branding on Eggman's mech. It's still there, you just can't see it. Their whole body is now shiny too, which actually looks very good. And the body of the artificial chaos is slightly transparent on the Dreamcast, being fully opaque on the GameCube. The same also happens to the item balloons. This happens due to an issue in transparency that is also present in Sonic Adventure DX, and while I did explain this in my video comparing the different versions of that game, I'll quickly go over it here as well. The original Dreamcast versions of these games took advantage of its hardware features that are simply impossible to recreate on the GameCube, specifically order-independent transparency. Transparency is a very complex problem in 3D graphics, as to properly display transparent models together with non-transparent ones, the polygons in a 3D scene have to be rendered in a specific order, as you normally can't put something behind a transparent object once it's already been rendered there. This can get even more complex in scenes with many transparent objects and moving cameras. With order-independent transparency, all of this is irrelevant as the developers can create scenarios and effects without giving a second thought to draw order, allowing for more creative freedom. Since the GameCube doesn't support OIT at a hardware level, workarounds had to be made, with SADX and SA2 Battle making use of two specific ones. The first is a draw queue system which tells the game which models should be rendered in what order. While this doesn't work very well in SADX since each environment wasn't properly adjusted and set up for this, in SA2 Battle it doesn't look as bad since it didn't have many complex transparencies in the first place. However, the ones that really were more complex were eventually removed. The second is alpha rejection, mainly used to hide transparency problems or at least make them less obvious. For textures with an alpha channel, being the transparent part of an image, the game only displays the pixels whose transparency value is within a certain range. So if the game sets the threshold to, let's say, 50%, parts of textures which have an alpha value of 52% will be fully displayed, while those with 49% get that section completely obscured. In SADX, while it doesn't look too pretty, it does help somewhat. The effect these have in SA2, while less jarring, are usually accompanied by wrong layering, which besides those examples I mentioned, is also very noticeable on the Chaos Emeralds, for example. In an attempt to fight against these transparency errors, what was done in most instances was remove that transparency in the situations where it wasn't strictly necessary, such as the artificial chaos and the balloons, with the latter suffering the same fate in SADX. Another instance of this is Supersonic, whose stomach texture is clearly suffering from transparency issues. Sonic's regular model was adjusted as the stomach was made smaller, but that wasn't the case for the super form. Another thing that suffered quite a lot as a result of this was texture quality. While why this happens is also identical to Sonic Adventure DX, contrary to that game, SA2 Battle does have a fair amount of higher quality textures compared to its original game. However, the majority of them still suffered a loss in quality due to being converted from PVM, the texture archive format from the Dreamcast, to GVM, the GameCube's format. Both SA1 and SA2 use, for the most part, textures with an RGB 565 format, so a 16-bit image, with 5 bits for red and blue and 6 for green, or a RGB 1555, with 5 bits for everything and 1 for transparency. The more bits a texture has, the more definition will be present in a specified color channel. The norm nowadays would be something like a RGB 8888, so a 32-bit image. However, SA2 Battle's GVM format uses RGB 583 for basically everything, which can take form in an opaque texture, being RGB 555, or a transparent one, being a RGB 3444. In other words, 15-bit textures. While these are rough equivalents of the higher quality ones from the Dreamcast, they are lower quality than PVM because they are missing 1 bit in green and 1 bit in alpha, so the definition for those color channels is lower and thus there's visible color banding and artifacting in a lot of textures. The weirdest part about this is that GVM supports the higher quality RGB 565 and the RGB 1555 that PVM uses, yet it doesn't. There's a leftover script in SA2 Battle's files which was used to compress the texture files from PVM to GVM. Since the script invokes a program called GVRConf, which is not available to the public, it's presumable that this application did convert the original texture to the lower quality color formats of the GameCube version on purpose. This results in generally blurrier textures which lack most details, especially wear marks and such, as well as more aggressive color banding on colorful textures. The draw distance was increased in the ports, which was accompanied by the addition of more details to the stage environments, which is an improvement overall. Most of the animations in the ports are completely identical to the originals, but Shadow's ramp jump animation is slightly different in battle. While all the life icons are different in the ports, Sonic's is the one who suffered the biggest change, now better reflecting the look he has in the game. The other ones were mainly taken at a different angle, and Rouge now looks at the camera. The soap posters in City Escape, Radical Highway and Mission Street have not only been modified but also swapped around. City Escape uses Radical Highway's design, Radical Highway uses Mission Street's design, and Mission Street uses City Escape's design. A lot of other posters and billboards have also been redesigned or completely swapped, but I'll get into that when I cover their specific stages. The Mystic Melody doors are also different, now having a border added, though weirdly they now look unnaturally dark in some specific areas. The Dreamcast HUD erroneously refers to Rouge's treasure scope as sunglasses, which is Knuckles' equivalent item. This was of course fixed in battle. All of Pig's cameos have been removed in the GameCube, although you can still see him if you spam the A or B buttons in cutscenes. Some of these cameo appearances were replaced with rings, which do count towards the perfect ring bonus, meaning that getting it in some levels is downright impossible and the others weren't replaced with anything. While most people think this decision was intentional, it seems that it wasn't really. The rings are due to his entry in the object list for these stages pointing to rings and not big, which were used as placeholders during the porting process, as is proven by the Space World 2001 trailer. However, the stages that don't replace him with a ring actually point to Big's object, but he still doesn't appear for unknown reasons. The 2012 re-release of SA2 Battle re-adds him to the levels, except in Wild Canyon, being most likely an oversight. And the bright light under the player character when traveling over the transparent floors in the Arc levels looks slightly different. Even so, there's still a significant number of intentional changes made for SA2 Battle that really are downgrades compared to what the original sought to do. The water texture is different between both versions, with the ports having more ripples and being darker too. This can look alright in some situations, but in most it looks weird. The pulley object blinks in the original game to make it stand out against the backdrop, while in the GameCube it just kinda glows, which makes it look very odd. The environment mapping effect on objects is quite broken in battle, as it gets looks really dark and pretty much unnoticeable when viewed at certain angles. Another texture problem has to do with the port's global texture index. This index basically stores, within certain ranges, different texture archives for easy management and access by the game's engine. However, its implementation is not perfect and causes some objects to access the wrong texture archive and thus using incorrect textures. The harmful meteor in matte space has a purple blaze effect in the Dreamcast version, being almost completely invisible in the ports, most likely as a result of transparency issues. And lastly, another effect removed in battle because of transparency errors is the blue flame that comes out of the gun hornet's rear in the original. As for audio differences, they are also pretty much the same as SADX's, although without the quality downgrade issue. Touching a boost ramp will play the booster sound effect for as long as your character is in contact with it in the Dreamcast version, making it play multiple times, while in the GameCube it only plays once. This happens because the original version, much like SA1, had a number of sound bugs related to sounds not stopping when needed, which chokes the game's sound queue and makes it stop all other sounds. To fix this, SADX and SA2 Battle made it impossible for most sounds to play more than once by default, and unless a sound is played with a certain flag that allows it to repeat, then it won't. While this bug fix works well enough in Battle in most situations, in SADX it caused issues with some sounds not playing more than once when necessary since they weren't adjusted for this. Another sound issue has to do with a change from 30 to 60 FPS, namely in cutscenes, making some lines being said earlier or later than expected, which causes that issue with the characters talking on top of one another and the lines not being synced with the subtitles and the mouth movements.
Wow, he's fast! Hey, it's not his speed, he must be using the Chaos Emerald to warp!
Shadow, I'm the world's ultimate life form.
Wow, he's fast! Hey, it's not his speed, he must be using the Chaos Emerald to warp!
Shadow, I'm the world's ultimate life form.
However, I'll dig further into cutscene problems in a bit. Also, some songs don't loop properly in the Dreamcast version. While it features ADX music files much like the other subsequent versions which have looping capabilities, the music in here fades out and restarts at some point, while in other versions it loops seamlessly. Other general differences include Tails' flight sound in Chao World in the ports, which sounds more like it did in Sonic 3, the back rings now reusing the gold ring sound effects, since in the original game they had the same ambient and activation sounds as Lost Chao, which was not the intended result. And the sound the mechwalkers make when landing on a solid surface is different. Battle also introduced a considerable number of changes to game mechanics and the gameplay itself. Most of these can be considered quality of life features. Of course, the game now runs at 60 FPS instead of 30. In the Dreamcast version, the controller dead zone was so low that it made walking directly forwards almost impossible without slight twitching, which in the max stages really compromises the gameplay, since every time you turn you lose the speed you have. The controls were made a bit less sensitive in battle, which is an improvement, but what's not an improvement is what was done in the 2012 port. Due to an incorrect division value in the Sonic input calculation code, the controls were made really stiff and you can really only turn anyway by pushing the control stick all the way in a direction. This is especially an issue when rail grinding, since you can't make slight precise adjustments to your direction to maximize speed gain. You either turn completely left or completely right, triggering the unbalance animation. Knuckles and Rouge can latch onto walls underwater by jumping into them on the Dreamcast. This was taken out in the GameCube due to it disrupting gameplay, as you might expect. Since the original game didn't make any reference to this ability, nor did it necessitate its use, it's presumable that it was actually a glitch. Sometimes it was hard to find the items you have to collect in the treasure hunting stages despite knowing you're close to them. To help in this, an exclamation mark in a red bubble pops up over their heads in the ports, making pinpointing a hidden key or emerald much easier. Knuckles and Rouge's uppercut attacks have absurd hitboxes in the original game, which can be used to, for example, open the safes in Security Hall without unlocking them first. These were made smaller in battle to make them less exploitable. Some bugs related to the results screen have been fixed for Sonic and Shadow, namely the situation where if they hit a wall after touching the goal ring, their falling animation will override the victory pose, causing them to be standing still and off-center, while in battle the victory animation has priority over any other. Also, in Metal Harbor, the leftover debug feature where if you press the Y button with a second controller, Sonic will gain access to a board, was removed. If you touch the goal ring in this state, he'd fall off the level during the results screen, but since this ability isn't present in battle anymore, you can't replicate this. On the same note, Sonic and Knuckles' victory pose cameras were altered to make the characters look directly at them. The Dreamcast version had an oversight where the mech characters also lose health when they have a shield, instead of only losing the latter. In battle, this doesn't happen anymore, and they don't lose health points as was most likely intended. These characters as Vulcan cannons also lock onto enemies slightly faster in the ports, every 8 frames instead of every 12, and its firing rate was slightly increased. The Boo enemies don't start moving in the Dreamcast version until you get somewhat close to them, while in the GameCube and subsequent ports they're always active. It was probably like that in the Dreamcast for performance reasons though. The camera has one fixed rotation speed in the original version, while Battle makes use of the GameCube's analog trigger buttons to move the camera at a speed equivalent to how hard you press the triggers. Even so, Chao World and 2-player mode still have a fixed speed. In the Dreamcast, security cameras counted towards the score combo multiplier in the mech levels, but in SA2 Battle they don't. Some glitches were also fixed, such as this one, where if Sonic bounces and hits a hanging container from underneath, he'll clip through the wall and fall off the stage, while in battle he just clips through the container instead of going out of bounds. Other thing that was corrected in battle was the RNG in the Kart stage's balloons, where in the original the amount of rings they'd give was predetermined and was fixed to 20 rings at max, while in the ports it's random at all times, sometimes capping at 30, others at 40 rings. The Mission 6 glitch is also missing in the ports. You'd get this glitch by selecting Chao World, then exiting, then pressing A and B at the same time in another level, going right 5 times and selecting the level. This would cause the stage to load as normal, although you'll get soft locked after finishing it, but the mission text would have some errors, such as loading another stage's text. And the emblem distribution in Chao World is completely different between both versions. In the Dreamcast, Chao World awards 10 emblems, all of which are obtained by completing each of the 5 groups of races in Chao Race, with everyone giving 2 emblems. In the GameCube, however, Chao World only awards 9 emblems now, with the 5 Chao Race groups only giving 1 each, and the remaining 4 are obtained by completing the 4 levels of Chao Karate. The absent 10th emblem is awarded by completing every mission of Canon Score with an A rank. Sonic Adventure 2 Battle's main selling point was its overhauled 2-player mode more than anything else, being the reason why it's called Battle in the first place. Given this, it's expectable that most of it is at least considerably different compared to the original version. Multiplayer, much like the rest of the game, now runs at 60 FPS instead of 30, although at the cost of barely being able to see what's in front of you. Also, the models used for the intro cameras are the higher poly ones, though actual gameplay uses the lower poly versions from the Dreamcast's multiplayer. In the original game, the teams are determined first, and then the type of match is chosen with the alternate option to choose a stage manually. In the ports, the type of match is chosen first, and only then do you select the characters, followed by a mandatory stage select. Also, selecting the type of match is done through the 2-player menu itself in the GameCube version, while in the Dreamcast the match types were separated into Action, Kart Race and Chao Race. On that note, the 2-player menu was heavily redesigned for battle, with unique music being made and a new menu featuring the main cast of characters standing in the background. This menu in the Dreamcast version is more like the story select, even reusing most of the same assets. The original game forced 2-player matches to be one hero character against a dark character, while in the ports individual characters are selected instead, allowing for match combinations originally not possible in the Dreamcast. While the Dreamcast version only had 9 levels, the GameCube version adds 21 new stages. The original ones are also now found in the level 3 stages, except for Weapons Bed, which is level 2. Battle options were added in the ports via the stage select, Select, allowing you to tweak different settings related to the match, including handicaps such as stronger special attacks, time limits, and the number of matches. The most you can do in the Dreamcast version is get a best of 3 match by starting it through the main menu, or a single match via the stage select. The GameCube version added a progress bar at the bottom of the screen, so it's easier to tell who's in front and how far away the goal is. Some oversights were also fixed, namely Eggman mentioning Tails even when against a Chao Walker on the Dreamcast, with him saying a different line when not facing Tails in battle. His victory line was also adjusted for this.
Better luck next time, Fox Boy! How's that?
On the same note, his intro camera is also different. Shadow's jump dash has him doing a different grunt for some reason. The alternate costumes are accessed differently in both versions. In the original game, they're found by pressing left or right while highlighting the preferred match or stage, while in the ports you need to press up while hovering over the corresponding characters in the character select. These costumes are unlocked in the Dreamcast version by completing every mission available to that character, and doing so with an A rank would unlock the alternate characters. In the GameCube, however, these characters are instead available by default and have new unique abilities fitting sound effects and intro cameras. These also controlled identically between each other in the original game, but have unique playstyles and attributes in SA2 Battle. Such an instance is Amy, which has lost her spin dash and saw her jump height nerfed, but her ring specials were discounted by 50%, meaning she can use a power-up every 10 rings instead of every 20. Metal, on the other hand, has seen his jump height buffed and his glow was changed from yellow to blue. He's also lost his spin dash, but now has a shield that protects him from most special attacks and gives him a momentum boost when going down slopes, like he's skating on ice or something. Well, it feels like he's skating on ice at all times, since his traction is worse, meaning he slips around a lot. The Chao Walker is much faster than the other mechs, and its special abilities were discounted, only needing 15 rings. However, his attack power is much lower compared to the other characters, needing to fire 5 bullets to kill. The Dark Walker takes less damage, also tanking 5 bullets, its Crazy Rush fires 2 sets of missiles, and it fires 24 rockets with the Hell Bomber fires instead of 12, even if not all of them home into the target. However, it's the slowest Walker in the game by far, and has the slowest firing rates. Tikal has no green/far tone on her radar, meaning she can only detect emeralds when she's at least near enough to trigger the yellow signal. Her special attack animation is also different, and she moves slightly faster than she did on the Dreamcast. In contrast, Chaos Zero moves slower than it did before, and its time freeze now lasts a whopping 30 seconds instead of 10. The animations for its spiral attack are different, as well as the special attack one, and it also has a slower punching speed. Additionally, completing every mission for a character now unlocks new cards, and doing so with an A rank unlocks the costumes. These costumes have also seen specific changes made to their gameplay. For example, while Shadows in the original game had the same attributes as his normal outfit, in the ports it gives a 5-second Chaos Control every 20 rings, instead of a speed up at 20, Chaos Spear at 40, and a 10-second Chaos Control at 60. Also, each of these outfits was redesigned in some way, with only Tails being similar to the original. In my opinion, while some are just different, Eggman's new one is better, but Shadows and especially Sonic's are a huge downgrade. On the same note, the Dreamcast version included seasonal costumes for Christmas and Halloween in 2-player modes, which could be unlocked through special menu themes that needed to be downloaded into the VMU, being completely removed from the ports. Also similar is that all of the alternate characters are the same in the GameCube version, with the exception of one, Big the Cat, which was present in the original game and replaced Eggman's alternate character slot, being substituted by a dark version of the Chao Walker, and each character was given a unique background for their special attack animation in battle, since the original game simply displays the stage in the background. The object layouts for the actual stages have also seen a few differences. Starting by Radical Highway, there is an extra checkpoint after the first loop, another one was added after the downward spring spiral, as well as an extra 4 rings in the middle of the old arrangement. After homing attacking some beetles, the 2 sets of rings don't share the same location. The area where you land after jumping off the first swinging bar had 20 rings added, an extra checkpoint was added before the second swinging bar. After crossing the gap in the bridge, 15 more rings and 2 extra containers were added when taking the lower routes. The highest section of the bridge added 30 more regular rings and the 20 rings item box at the very top. In the area before the level splits into 2 paths, the GameCube replaced an item box with a balloon, some wood containers are now metal boxes, and an extra checkpoint was added too. And another balloon and checkpoint were added before the final part of the stage. As for Green Forest, an item box was added before entering the tunnel, the Rhino Spike enemy was replaced replaced with an item box, another item box was added after the first vine swing, and another 2 worth 5 rings each were upgraded to 10 rings each. The left half of the big platform added a giant tree and 2 item boxes, an extra spring and item box were added at the end of the floating platform segment. After that section, a checkpoint was removed. Just before this spring, an item box was removed. Underneath the mid-air circle of rings, the GameCube version added both an extra item box and a spring, and extra platforms and springs were added underneath all of the floating item boxes. As for Sky Rail, one of the pumpkin head pillars added a launch missile and replaced the extra life with more rings. An item box was added to the area near the Rhino Medal. Right next to it, a new platform was added. After using the first fan spring, the second one in the Dreamcast version was replaced with the normal variant on GameCube, and an item box was added where you land after using it. Going right from here, the extra life was replaced with 20 rings. The platform this second fan spring is laying on is completely different between both versions. Its max height was also adjusted to be higher, and after this rail segment, the GameCube version added an extra checkpoint. As for Wild Canyon, the only change in it is the character's starting position, originally having them spawn on a spot where a ring is meant to be, but in the GameCube they were moved closer to the edge of this area. Lastly, for Meteor Hurt, the D5 platform saw a meteor added as to make the big block breakable. The cage block inside one of the unsealed containers stays in midair when you break the wooden box below it, with its physics being fixed in SA2 battle. It not falling down also allowed you to climb the wall, go inside the indestructible container, and clip through the floor, and 3 extra hint monitors were also added throughout multiple areas. Now it's time to finally address the elephant in the room, Sonic Adventure 2 Battles cutscenes. In SA2 in general, the cutscenes are self-contained, meaning they don't play on top of gameplay like they do in Sonic Adventure. However, this introduces a pretty obvious problem in the ports, updating the models accordingly. Of course, the models used in the cutscenes and during gameplay are pretty consistent in the original game, as is to be expected, but this is not exactly the case in the ports. In most cases, the characters just keep using their Dreamcast models, with the only exceptions being Eggman's cannon and Sonic in a select few shots. And while it isn't much compared to what's been downgraded, there's still a significant number of improvements and tweaks made both in general and to specific cutscenes that needed it. Every cutscene now runs at 60 FPS, making them look more dynamic. All FMVs had their resolution upgraded and uncropped. The Dark Stories shuttle scene saw Sonic using his regular shoes instead of the soap shoes, which was corrected in the ports. Similarly, Sonic now uses the correct shoes when he busts out of the helicopter. Many characters had their textures upgraded to twice the original resolution. Also, several cult background objects were replaced. If you don't know, culling is a performance saving measure that hides certain parts of an object when viewed from the back, since they aren't usually seen from that angle, which wasn't properly adjusted in some cutscenes in the original game. The camera work in the hero story intro is slightly different and now hides the floating door in the background. Sonic uses his higher poly model in the first 2 scenes, and then basically never again. The second scene is the only time a character other than Sonic also uses the higher poly version of their model, being Shadow. Knuckles' eye was clipping into his head in the original, which was fixed in battle. The Eggmobile has a less aggressive shadow in this cutscene. The tunnel in the limousine cutscene was given a shadow to make the lighting more realistic, although the road texture, while being the same, lost most of its color. The fencing in this area didn't render correctly, which was also fixed. The limo's windows are now tinted on the inside. The lock on Tails' emerald box now renders properly, although the transparency issues on the emerald are crazy. The emeralds inside the Eclipse cannon are more vibrant, making it easier to understand what's actually inside of it. In a cutscene where Sonic gets trapped, he didn't walk all the way to the trap itself in the original version, being properly adjusted in the ports. His reaction to getting trapped has also been reanimated to feel less awkward. Shadow's capsule glows more in the GameCube version, and it looks really good, even without all those transparency issues. New, more dynamic cameras were added to Rouge's version of her first scene. Eggman's computer was given a new standby background, replacing that weird grey square of the original. Shadow's animations when he's rescuing Rouge were redone, since they looked pretty rough in the original. Sonic was half blind in this scene, being gifted a full vision in battle. The liquid in the Arc score is animated now, and the floor at the Emerald Altar flashes different tones of red. And that's about it for improvements. Now let's get into the really significant portion of changes introduced in the ports, which are quite the opposite of an improvement. The lighting has suffered the most out of anything in the GameCube. Every character has a darker, duller look, which makes them look really out of place at times. While the Dreamcast version had shadows beneath all characters and objects, most of these are missing in the ports, even if the mechs did get upgraded shadows. Transparency, as always, is also one of the biggest offenders when it comes to downgraded looks. Texture quality loss also plagues most scenes due to lazy conversion between formats, as I've mentioned before. There are inconsistent edits made to scenes, namely when it comes to the space cutscenes. For example, in this one, Earth has faded edges which looks pretty good, while in another it has solid edges identical to how it was originally. When Sonic lands on the helicopter's wing, he switches back to the Dreamcast model, just notice the pointy ears. Sonic is shaded less here, which makes it hard to perceive the depth on some of his face features. The bright light behind Sonic is also missing in this shot, making the scene duller. Well, it isn't exactly missing, it just has no shine. What's really missing, however, are the blades behind him. The lens flare present when Sonic falls past the camera was also removed. The city below isn't properly lit, giving it a weird grey tint which is not the intended look. The texture itself had some minor changes made to make the colors more consistent with each other. In other words, it was made almost completely desaturated, which looks arguably worse. The small detail where Sonic's ear moves when he notices shadow was removed, as I mentioned previously in the video. Bigfoot's pilot is missing due to a ridiculous transparency error, which means he's still there, you just can't see it as a result of it. Sonic has basically no lighting all throughout the scene, although shadow looks fine in most situations. Strangely, he does have lighting in the Dark Stories version, which now creates an inconsistency with both versions of the scene. Shadow's emerald has layering issues, obscuring the shining effect that's supposed to be displayed in front of it. The emerald itself is suffering from transparency issues, as I've mentioned before. The chaos control effects originally obscured the chaos emerald, but in battle it's overlaid on top of them. A green flashing is also missing from this effect, although it wasn't removed entirely, it's just put under the floor. Similarly, Shadow's face lights up when he leaves, but the rest of his body doesn't. Other detail removed was Sonic lowering his brow when he gets blinded, which doesn't happen anymore. Knuckles and Rouge look like they're not really there in their encounter scene, well, Knuckles especially, as he had a glossy look replaced by flat lighting. The Eggmobile is missing its front windows for some reason. The shine isn't as bright when Knuckles breaks the Master Emerald, due to none other than transparency issues. The tornado doesn't cast a shadow on the water. The lighting is almost completely absent in this cutscene, making Tails' eyes stand out a lot compared to everything else. Layering issues also plague the tornado model, as the markings in the top cannon are gone. Texture quality also takes quite a hit, as the wing becomes a blurry mess instead of having noticeable dents and wear. Amy has no lighting at all and it now looks like she's glowing. A door in the background lost its texture for some reason. Amy's eyes are doing something in the ports, as they're really big and too close together, making her look cross-eyed. In addition, she has no teeth. Okay, I'm lying, they're there but are completely red, which is basically the same thing, as you can't notice them anyways. Her eyelids also tend to be darker. The lighting downgrades are especially noticeable in the Cell cutscene, as each bar casted its own shadow, but in SA2 Battle the scene looks really dull in comparison. Sonic's eyes clip through his eyelids when he does certain poses. The fake building shadows in this cutscene were replaced by a blockier, more generic one. Another thing that's pretty well known in this scene in battle is that it weirdly takes place in Skyrail. Not really a consequence of it, but the whites here are brighter while Tails' body remains the same. Most lighting is missing in this scene and Amy's shadow is really broken, going up the wall. The wall itself also got darker, which makes no sense when you consider that the light source is hitting it directly. Knuckles' shadow can be seen before he pushes up the manhole cover. He's also very dark. The last shot uses a different camera angle with missing trees and missing geometry. In the Dreamcast, this angle was used to hide that, but the map wasn't adjusted in the ports. The road also changes color at the end, which is really strange. The smoke particle effect is bugged, being drawn under the car. The camera that follows the limo goes inside the tunnel geometry for a few moments. This tree is really suffering from layering issues. I don't really know what happened here. The president's suit is using an incorrect blending mode, making it look much darker, while also losing every single detail possible. There are several layering issues with the sofas. The environment shadows are opaque in battle, making it look like Sonic is running over oil or something. This happens since they're also using an incorrect blending mode. The pyramid cutscene is missing the lens flare effect. The face Knuckles makes here is different between both versions. Sonic's thumbs up pose is different here, as it randomly decides to use the high poly model and the camera angle was also changed. Some of the lighting in the next scene can actually be considered an improvement, having more depth and being more in place with the setting. This also fixes the issue in the Dreamcast where where Knuckles' body was properly shaded but his head wasn't. However, most complex lighting effects and shadows are completely missing. The face-off between Knuckles and Rouge has a different background. While the texture is the same, it's much darker and blurrier. It also scrolls around instead of being static. However, at some point it reverts back to how it was in the Dreamcast, since the layer that's used to make the scrolling effect stops showing up. It's also supposed to be transparent, but of course it isn't. The planet in SA2 Battle is brighter and smaller, although has a nice fading effect. Eggman's gun is missing the reflection texture on the scope. Sonic's wrist also clips through his glove in the same scene. When you look at the planet in the shot where Sonic is shot out of the arc, the fading effect is completely absent and looks unfinished instead. The capsule's timer is suffering from transparency issues, making it harder to tell which numbers are there. The floor here is missing most effects and lighting, especially the reflection on the glass. The same happens with the windows. In the first cutscene of the Dark Story, instead of red lighting effects, the screen just gets tinted red. The door Eggman comes out of is also missing for some reason, and the explosion effects look brighter in the ports. The red light in this story isn't blinking on the GameCube. Eggman's screen and shadow overlap his flashlight, which looks pretty odd. While in the original game the flashlight was always on for the duration of this cutscene, in battle it switched off at some point. The news on Eggman's computer get incorrectly drawn behind the transparent screen in the ports, making them really hard to see. Maria has no eyelashes in battle. Some effects from Eggman's computer still get drawn when they're not supposed to, which makes them clip through Rouge's head here. The strong light that's supposed to appear when the console activates is improperly layered, which makes Shadow look weird, especially because only his face lights up. The light around the emerald slots is very broken. Almost every issue mentioned is present in this specific shot where Shadow inserts his emeralds. As the glow effect is incorrectly layered, the platform, Shadow and the emerald overlap the effects, and the door behind Eggman can be seen. Character shadows are missing in the first time you go to the jungle. The lights in the background here don't shine as bright due to transparency issues. This cutscene also has the funniest occasion of cross-eyed Amy. She's also completely mangled in this shot. The emeralds next to Rouge are missing here. The character reflections on the Ark's windows are missing as they get drawn behind the space backgrounds. The console screen has a triangle in it for whatever reason. Tails looks red in the Skyrail cutscene. The skybox also has a different positioning and a stronger fog effect in the ports. What appears in the console screen here is very different in battle compared to the original game. In the Dreamcast, what Rouge is saying syncs up with what's going on in the screen, while in the GameCube it doesn't really line up at all. Eggman's arc map is replaced by a duplicate image of Tails. The worst part about this is that he brings forward the exact same picture, yet the cutscene will still display the map texture. The cutscene where the air explodes is missing the planet, as well as the window shine and Shadow's reflection. All of these get overlaid by the space backgrounds. The emerald slots revert to their Dreamcast coloring, the light above the cannon is still obscured, and the green light looks especially terrible due to transparency issues. The warning texture isn't synced with the flashing lights. It also said danger originally. And here is another ridiculous example of transparency issues. The video in the console doesn't sync up Gerald appearing with Eggman's line, so he gets shocked too early. Another door is missing here. The planet is too small to be visible in this scene, and it also uses the Dreamcast look. There's a really noticeable layering issue with the Master Emerald's light. I simply don't know how they keep doing this. The giant Chaos Control is missing its inner light, which seems like loss of detail, especially considering how Sonic and Shadow don't get affected by the light itself. The ending is also suffering from missing reflections. During the credits, part of the space background at the top left doesn't move for some reason, and the regular planet also gets swapped by a neon version of it, since its glow is incorrectly drawn on top of it. As you can see, small changes were made to every single event in the game, and while some are inarguable improvements, there's a really noticeable lack of polish in these that obscure everything else that was done to make them better. Even if a lot of these problems aren't really noticeable at first glance, a significant amount still is, and ends up not carrying the intended look and atmosphere from the quote-unquote obsolete Dreamcast version to the more accessible and supposedly enhanced ports. And that's about it for general differences. Now let's take a look at more specific stuff, starting by action stages. I'll be covering them by character, so we'll start by going over Sonic stages, then Tails, Knuckles, Shadow, Rouge, and finally Eggman. Besides graphical differences, most of these stages have also had their level design and object layout slightly altered for the ports. Since it's the first and arguably the most iconic stage in the game, it's expectable that City Escape was one of the stages that saw the most changes. The first thing you'll notice is that more more cars are parked along the roads in the GameCube version, since the more powerful hardware allows for more objects and thus more scenery. In the original game, smoke would come off of a car when you ran into one. This effect is completely absent in the ports though. The textures used for most things are much blurrier compared to the Dreamcast. The trees were also changed, using different models for the logs and textures for the canopy. This 20 ring box can only be obtained in the Dreamcast by doing a trick off of a ramp at a high enough speed, and even then it was very easy to simply go over it. In the GameCube, an extra life capsule was added to reward this. The park trams were adjusted, with the first one being slightly moved back and an extra one added after the first checkpoint. The layout of the posters seen throughout the stage is different, with many of them being redesigned or completely replaced. Steps in sets of stairs in the original game changed size halfway through. This was fixed in battle since it's a clear oversight. More plants can be seen placed along the top of the stage in certain areas. However, numerous environment pieces were also removed, such as this set of flowers just after the boarding segment. A throwable tire object was also added in this area, as well as at the top of the half pipe past the first grind rail. Some ring capsules give different amounts between both versions. The area with stairs and gun robots on the multiple edges on either side was completely redesigned. On the Dreamcast, welcome could be read on the patches of grass, and there was a simple arch leading into the next street. In the ports, the welcome was removed and the arch was turned into a more elaborate tunnel. The gun robot was also changed from a gun hunter on the other side of the arch to a gun beetle in front of the tunnel. A graphical error on GameCube causes several rings to cast shadows in midair on that loop before the wall run. Overhangs were added above various parts of the stage, such as the grinding segments and the wall run area. Besides this, battle has an extra wall on the left here. It was possible to jump off the building during the wall run and access the Mystic Melody section earlier than intended in the original version. The ports had an invisible wall to prevent this from happening. Speaking of the Mystic Melody area, it also saw a few tweaks, namely the first two gun beetles being changed from ordinary mono beetles to indestructible spring beetles in the GameCube, as well as that version adding a spring beetle underneath the spark beetle, making this section slightly easier. This area with the gun beetles hovering over the floating platforms has a completely different object layout. The Dreamcast has a line of 5 mono beetles, with the last one flying lower than the others, while in the GameCube the last beetle was replaced with a spring and a short line of rings. Also, the original has more platforms than the ports. An Omochao prompting the player to whistle was added at the end of the stage. Big's cameo was removed and wasn't replaced with anything. And as for hard modes, the light dash chain over the pit is 2 rings longer in SA2 Battle. Now let's take a look at Metal Harbor. Since this is a very short stage, it has seen one of the fewest changes compared to the original. However, as is to be expected, it still contains a significant amount of them. Much like City Escape, more scenery and detail were added all throughout the level, namely extra carriers and missile launch stations in the background. A slight blue fog was also added, which doesn't look too pretty honestly. The top of the scaffolding near the light shoes is surrounded by fences in the Dreamcast and indestructible crates in the GameCube. This change makes it possible to get on top of the scaffolding itself without a bounce bracelet, even if there's nothing there anyways. Just after the aircraft carrier, one empty pallet was removed from the left side. The same change was made in the area after the jump panel. The chain of 5 mono beetles leading to the final platform before the missile has an extra beetle in battle, and the other ones have a slightly different positioning. The sky was extended during the missile sequence, and once again, much like City Escape, Big's cameo was simply removed and wasn't replaced with anything, and the location where Sonic poses at the end is different. As for hard modes, the ports, for some reason, have 75 rings layered on top of each other at the start of the stage. It's impossible to collect them normally without dying, but doing so will award you that amount. An item box with 20 rings was added to where the light shoes are in the GameCube version, with the other changes made for the normal layout also being present here. One of the hangers on the carrier has rings inside it in all versions. However, they're randomly positioned in midair in the Dreamcast, while in the ports they're in a rectangle. After the dash ramp in the previous area, the empty pallet on the left picked up a crate and was moved to the right side of the walkway, and the ports remove a throwable helmet from next to the 20 ring box on the final platform before the missile. As for Green Forest, it also didn't see too many changes, but the ones that were made are pretty noticeable. The most out of all though is the fact that more plants were added to the environment, which looks much better compared to the sometimes empty look of the original. More decorations were also added in the bungee jumping set piece. There was a tree added to the big platform at the middle of the stage. The Dreamcast has an invisible platform near the tree climb, and while it wasn't removed in the GameCube version for some reason, it was moved out of the way. The island where the cutscene with Shadow takes place adds a small tunnel to the left in the ports. The area behind the gold ring was changed from a simple green wall to a giant tree. Contrary to the previous 2 stages, stages, Big was actually replaced with a ring in the ports. And as for hard modes, the Mystic Melody Altar and all of its assets are missing from the Dreamcast but are restored in battle. Now let's take a look at Pyramid Cave, being one of the stages that saw the most changes made to its object layouts. The Omochao that explains how the hourglass mechanic works is floating in midair on the Dreamcast, which was fixed in battle. The section after the first pulley saw 8 rings added on the main path as opposed to the 0 found in the Dreamcast. The same addition was made for the area before the twin launch plates. Well, to be fair, most areas that didn't have any rings saw a few added, especially on the large grind rail. A small animal near the first Chao box was replaced with a large torch object. There's a darker black fog in the Dreamcast version that fits the atmosphere of the level better. The bounce bracelet area is slightly different, as rings, statues and an item capsule were added around it, whereas in the original only a cage and 2 E1000 enemies were present. Speaking of them, a third one was added below the large grind rail. This area saw a lot of added snake statues. The gold beetle was moved from the right side to the left side since it was easily missable. Weirdly, the flaming spring has an invisible wall around it on the GameCube that makes it impossible to use. As is to be expected, this works normally in the original game, so it's anyone's guess why you can't use it anymore. More spinning signs were added at the end of the stage. Their brightness is also displaying incorrectly in most instances, as some appear darker and others really bright, regardless of how far away they are. Much like the previous stage, Big's appearance was replaced with a single ring, despite it being normally unobtainable. And as for hard modes, the E1000 robots guarding the second key are positioned closer to the wall. Now it's time for Crazy Gadget, which also saw a significant number of changes made to it. Most of these include aesthetic changes, such as at the very start of the level, where the ports had light beams and loads of side panels. Some of these may be related to Nintendo's rivalry with Microsoft's Xbox, as it had a lot of green X symbols which ended up being removed, such as the small grabbable boxes redesign. The spark beetles after the first warp tube were replaced with mono beetles. As such, Omochao doesn't tell you to beware of electric shields, he just tells you to be careful not to fall. Project Shadow logos were added to some walls in the stage. Some green lights on the walls are paler, while others have a glowing effect not found in the Dreamcast. A rail was added below the part where you need to perform a light dash after a line of beetle robots. The beetles in the second crossing also have different positionings between both versions, and the ring trail was reduced from 6 to 5 rings. Since there was originally no rail here, Omochao tells you to be careful not to fall, while in the GameCube he finally says the beware of electric shields line. The big light dash area saw some floating light posts added to it. The block segment had no rings by the gun beetle, with some being added in the GameCube. The goal area was completely redesigned in the ports. Big's cameo was simply removed and wasn't replaced with anything. As for hard modes, after the large light dash, there's only one artificial chaos on the Dreamcast, while in SA2 Battle there are now 2. Also, after the last 2 brides, the artificial chaos type is different between both versions. Before the first switch in the block set piece, there are no enemies in the Dreamcast, while the ports had 2 gun hunters. The original version also has fewer containers compared to the ports. And lastly, the yellow block saw an extra artificial chaos added in SA2 Battle. Finally, for Sonic stages, we have Final Rush, with basically all of its changes being environment additions, as well as other things to make the level easier. The GameCube adds a lot more signs, blue rings and arrow ships. As a result, certain item boxes were moved due to things such as blue arrow tiles being added to the center of platforms. If you fail to jump off of the rail in this area, you could carry on to the next platform directly by hitting the spring below in the Dreamcast. However, the spring now redirects you to the 2 new vertical rails added in the GameCube. Much like Crazy Gadget, Big was removed and nothing was added to replace it. As for hard mode, in the area before entering the tunnel leading to the first checkpoint, the orange rail present in normal mode was removed in the Dreamcast version, being added back to Battle's object layouts. An orange rail was added at the end of the long rail shortcut to make failing the trick jump a bit more forgiving. The rail that has the spike ball at the end had the green trick jump sign added, however it doesn't work no matter how fast you go. And the quote-unquote rail city area had another orange rail added to make going to the middle path easier. And that's about it for Sonic's levels. Now let's take a look at Tails's. While these haven't gone through nearly as many changes as the previous ones, they still have quite a few. Prison Lane, however, is probably the one that saw the least of them. The stage really only had some environmental changes, such as extra cameras, canisters, ceiling lights and a white steam particle effect. The red fog present all throughout the stage is less aggressive though, and fades out at a distance instead of enveloping the level past a player camera. The light beams from the spotlights have also almost almost completely lost their transparency. The texture used for the walls in the walkways is different, there's nothing to replace Big's cameo in the parts, and almost every texture is much blurrier compared to the original game, losing their details. As for Mission Street, it does feature a more significant number of changes, even if it's not the one that saw the most. Even so, almost all differences are also environmental, such as more road signs and vehicles at the very start and end of the level. The skybox texture was changed in the GameCube version, as the Dreamcast uses the same one as Radical Highway. The fact that the ports are missing the blue lit building on the right is really noticeable right at the start of the stage, since you could see it in the distance. However, the building that stands in the same spot is taller but can't be seen as easily, which means the skybox is probably placed lower or further away in the ports. The police barricades have more cruisers in the GameCube, the wanted banners present throughout the level are completely static in the Dreamcast but blink every second in the ports. Like the previous level, Big was simply removed and nothing replaces him, and the advertisements were changed. The blue Chaos Soda ads from the Dreamcast are now the red Chaos Cola ads, the Chao in Space 2 ads are now Planet Chaos ads, and Samba de Taco ads are now Sub Burger ads. Now let's take a look at Hidden Base, which has seen the most changes out of any Tales level. It had a fair amount of aesthetic and object tweaks made to it, such as rings being added in new locations and other decorative objects, as there are more breakable pots, flags, and spinning decorations throughout. The sand in SA2 Battle looks significantly lighter than the Dreamcast, even if the texture is the same. The texture used for the sides of the sandstone platforms has probably suffered the worst quality downgrade in the whole game, as every single detail on the rock is completely blurred. The floor itself has also seen a really noticeable downgrade. The breakable Eggman doors seen in this stage have a slightly different coloring between both versions. On the Dreamcast, the door has a green section, being replaced with a tan color scheme. Eggman's eyes also look more detailed in the ports. The distant fog is darker on the GameCube, even though it does a better job at hiding the seams between the sand and the skybox. A new camera angle was added for these three short platforms at the beginning of the level, so you can actually see what you're doing if you drop down. 3 indestructible boxes were also added to the last platform. There's an Eggman door placed before the first Unidas enemy in the original game, and while it still exists in the GameCube, another one was added at the end of the hallway. The checkpoint after the Unidas was moved from right in front of the breakable door to the edge of the platform. The second platform in this area was moved slightly to the right. The last Unidas is placed right before the gold ring in the Dreamcast, being removed from the ports as it could and probably would most times overlap Tails during the results screen. Big's cameo was actually replaced with a single ring in battle, despite it being normally unobtainable. As for hard modes, it removed a bunch of Unidases from the stage for whatever reason. However, the last Unidas in the stage wasn't removed, but it's mistakenly placed inside its platform. And lastly, let's take a look at Eternal Engine, which saw the same nature of changes as any other level. The lighting is a bit brighter and lost its general blue tint on the GameCube. The collision detection on the airlocks wasn't the best in the original game, as it was possible to clip through them and go out of bounds. And while it still isn't perfect in the ports, at least there's no risk of dying. In the room before the 3 Beetles, there's an airlock on the floor that has 2 dynamites layered on top of each other on the Dreamcast. The extra one was removed in SA2 Battle, which was the intended result. One of the exterior areas has 4 rings and 1 dynamite pack in the original, while the port swapped the dynamite for 3 extra rings. Another dynamite was removed from the walkways at the top of this area. There were changes made to some of the artificial chaos. One of the vertical areas has a pulley and floor airlock guarded by this enemy, being the guard type in the Dreamcast and the float type in the GameCube. Big was removed, however there's no ring to replace him, and all Hornet 6s were changed to Hornet 3s near the end of the level. And that's it for Tails' levels. Now let's take a look at Knuckles', which have also seen moderately interesting changes made to them. Wild Canyon isn't one such instance, however, as it probably saw one of the least number of changes made of all stages in the game. It was mainly made easier, as a total of 8 hint monitors were added to it. The other main differences have to do with aesthetic tweaks, like swapping low poly models for higher detail ones, more turbines being added to the environment, and you can now see mountains in the distance. The rock textures also have different UVs, which makes them look lower quality. Fortunately, Big's cameo was replaced with a single ring in battle. Well, strangely this isn't GameCube exclusive, since the 2012 re-release doesn't have this specific appearance back for some reason. Pumpkin Hill, much like Wild Canyon, has barely seen any differences. However, it's one of the few stages where the graphical changes made to it can actually be considered improvements over the original. The skybox was lowered slightly and made larger due to the addition of another texture, which is actually great. The stage also received a bit of an extra texture polish in the GameCube, with added bone borders around some hollows and support support beams on the sides of certain cliffs. Big's cameo wasn't replaced with anything, and there's a bug here in SA2 Battle that completely hides the golden beetle for some reason, making it impossible to destroy it. Now we get to more interesting business with Aquatic Mine. While most changes were also made to its aesthetic, its layout has been revised a bit too. The stage is significantly brighter in the GameCube version, which can either be an improvement or a downgrade depending on how you see it. Personally, I think it doesn't fit. But in contrast, the underwater fog is brighter, which is a bit more realistic, without it really getting any harder to navigate. The metal floor at the start gains some rusty metal borders and also has stretched UVs for whatever reason. The texture was rotated too. The yellow striped hazard lines on the central platform were flipped in the ports and have a new red metallic texture between them instead of reusing the one for the platform. Generally, more torches, fans, unbreakable barrels and minecarts are present in SA2 Battle as a result of the more powerful hardware. There are also minecarts, barrels and wood beams added to areas that were otherwise almost completely empty originally. The nook with the two water switches was retextured for the ports, with green brick walls, support beams in the corners and the wooden floor replacing the Dreamcast single rock texture. 3 torches were added to the walls and a few plants were removed from the floor to fit the new artificial theming. The topmost cave has a much greener floor texture on GameCube. Some of the piles of wood are also missing, possibly because they were more of an obstacle than anything. The lantern fire lets off black smoke in the ports now, instead of the nothing in the Dreamcast. The skunk in the corner of the central room is out in the open in the original, with a straight shot of it right from the spawn point. The GameCube adds breakable minecarts in front of it. The ghost room was completely retextured. On the Dreamcast, it has rock walls and a red clay floor, looking pretty much identical to any other area in the stage. In the ports, however, it has grey brick walls with metallic support beams and slate floor, giving it an eerie, more suitable vibe. Some torches were also added. A makeover was also given to the little tunnel leading to the air necklace upgrade, with its rock and metal textures being replaced with red bricks. The Mystic Melody tunnel has 6 extra minecarts to break through on the GameCube for some reason. It's honestly hard to tell if this was done on purpose or if it was accidental. Like Pumpkin Hill, Big's cameo wasn't replaced with anything. As for hard modes, the ports had a circle of 8 rings to the beginning of the stage. There's an oven in the Dreamcast with a ring inside, with another ring being added in the ports. In the original, there's a seal roaming around the lowest level of the stage, with a wall fan just above it. None of these made the GameCube's final cut. The central part of the level with the barrels and fences was rotated 90 degrees to the left in the ports, and another oven was added beneath the Ghost Room tunnel. Death Chamber has seen practically no changes made. The only differences have to do with lighting and textures, as the stage is slightly brighter in the ports. The Dreamcast has darker fog, some of the wall textures appear to either be bugged or were intentionally cut down on the GameCube with far more obvious tilting, and the map screens have an animated static-like effect in the Dreamcast but are completely static in SA2 Battle besides text scrolling. Most details, such as wear marks, are also missing in the ports, with the ones that are present being really obviously copy-pasted. However, Big was actually replaced with a single ring in this level, which can't be obtained through normal means. Since Big has a different location in hard mode, the ring was added there too. And lastly, Meteor Herd is also almost entirely identical to the original version. The starting camera has a delay in the Dreamcast version that was removed on GameCube. The texture used for the walls around the perimeter of the level is different. Some flame jets are visible beneath the glass floors in battle. Big was simply removed and wasn't replaced with anything. One of the platforms at the top of the stage has a spring in the Dreamcast's hard mode, but not in the regular layout. For the sake of consistency, the GameCube has it in both. Speaking of which, the only difference in hard mode is this animal pipe, being placed correctly in the Dreamcast version but being almost completely buried on GameCube. And that's about it for Knuckles' levels. Now it's time to look at Shadows, which are some of the ones that saw the most changes. However, once again, the first level, being Radical Highway, isn't an example of those changes, as it barely saw any changes made to it. In fact, it's one of the few levels that saw literally no level design changes. No rings, no enemies, no platforms, nothing. Not even Big was replaced with a ring. Well, the only real differences are that more buildings were added to the background environment, but besides that, the level is pretty much identical, lighting and everything. Even so, there are the classic examples of some textures having wrong stretched UVs, with most of them losing a lot of definition, and the direction signs no longer glow red and have the same brightness between each other. In contrast, White Jungle has seen a significant number of changes. In general, it was given a major graphical upgrade in the ports, along with some object differences. The starting area has 2 large walls added rather than just a waterfall. However, there's really noticeable quality degradation on the water texture. The camera angle for this segment was also also slightly changed, as was the one in the first Vine Swing, which was tweaked. The overall atmosphere of the level is different between the versions. The Dreamcast goes for a more jungly feel, having a denser grayer fog along with a spore particle effect along the level. The GameCube on the other hand tones down the fog, also making it a bit purple and darker, and swaps the spores for rainfall. More arches and plants were added over parts of the stage in the GameCube version, some probably to make falling off harder and others for aesthetics. An extra platform was added to the back of the large square area, more beetle enemies can be found near the end of the stage in SA2 Battle, an Omochao was added next to the goal ring warning the player about falling. Taking him through the goal will make him comment about the fog being like San Francisco, even if the stage is using rain instead. Both of Big's appearances were simply removed and weren't replaced by anything. As for hard modes, there are more beetles in areas where there was only one, for example. This Rhino medal was removed, and the room shared with Green Forest has 2 more shield hunters now. Now let's take a look at Skyrail. The stage also only has aesthetic differences, and is otherwise the same in both versions gameplay-wise. Extra walls were added to the environment at the start of the level. More fog was added in the GameCube version. The yellow barriers warned you about there not being any solid ground past them, but since in most cases walls were added to where there was previously a cliff, they serve basically no purpose. More pumpkin rocks were added around the grind rail segments, as well as behind the goal ring. Generally, more trees, fans and metal beams were added to the level. Some of those pumpkin rocks also have a different positioning, and the skybox is placed a little more to the left. Like White Jungle, Big was removed and there's no ring where he was. As for hard modes, some barrels were missing in the Dreamcast that were re-added in the ports. This 10-ring capsule was removed in SA2 Battle for some reason, and the original game had 2 of the final barriers missing from this layout, which were restored on GameCube. Lastly, for Final Chase, some minor stage elements were tweaked, but other than that, it has largely the same changes as those made to Final Rush. More boost rings were added to rails, which looks much nicer. The height of the floating light objects was doubled in the ports. More of these, as well as more arrow signs, were added to the environment, making it look a bit less empty. Similarly, more arrow panels were added to the floors in certain areas, with the orange hexagon signs making more appearances throughout the level too. A single ring was removed from this arrangement in SA2 Battle, which seems accidental. When you come out of the blue pit, the ports had 4 metal containers near the bomb hornets. This area where you climb up the wall has a different dash panel arrangement, as it adds 2 of them on either side of the middle one, but removes the last one before the springs. The path to the Lost Chao is different, changing the total of rings in the light dash paths from 15 to just 9 and adds a ruin platform. As such, the angle of the rings themselves is different. Big wasn't replaced by anything in battle. A barrier was added to the last upward gravity beam to make getting on top a bit easier. These beams also have a few differences, namely the top glass part, which is less transparent and makes its hexagon pattern more obvious, and objects look a bit less glossy. As for hard modes, similar to Metal Harbor, if you turn back on the starting rail, there are 131 rings placed in one spot, and collecting them will give you that amount. After the first spinning cylinder, there's a single shield hunter in the original, with another one being added in the ports. Battle adds a lot more meteors to the layout, making it much harder. So much so that one even completely blocks an item box, making it impossible to collect without taking damage. And there's only one purple rail in the original, while the ports had another one. Also, the item box underneath the only rail on Dreamcast was removed. And that's it for Shadow. Next we'll take a look at Rouge's levels, which saw more changes made to its stage graphics and effects than anything else. Dry Lagoon is one such instance. It was given more hint boxes just like Wild Canyon, but besides that it only has aesthetic modifications. More butterflies were added throughout the level. The egg above the statue's head is exclusive to the Dreamcast. A glitch where you could abuse the ledge climbing mechanic to go out of bounds was fixed in the GameCube, as she doesn't perform the climbing animation. Big was replaced by a single ring in the ports, however it's placed underground, meaning you can't collect it anyways. And the wind platform has a totally different design between both versions. On Dreamcast, it's a solid column, but on GameCube it adds a nice glass design to it, getting rid of the ugly stone texture on top. The same sort of changes was made to Egg Quarters, which besides the visual changes is pretty much identical to the original. However, contrary to Dry Lagoon, this level saw visual downgrades instead of upgrades, since the lighting effects in rooms that guard robots inhabit are different. The Dreamcast has a green, more threat brightening scanline flowing through each room, while in the ports the camera simply glows, which looks much worse. The same change was also made for the red version when caught by one of the robots. Much like the previous level, Big's appearance was replaced with a single ring. The wallflower has its middle yellow part completely solid in the original game, so Rouge can't dig through it, but in SC2 Battle she can. And as expected, there's really noticeable color bending on the GameCube's conversion of this texture, as it now looks really blurry close to the center and has less detail towards the end of the petals. Security Hall, yes, you guessed it, also really only has aesthetic modifications and is otherwise the same between both versions. The fog is considerably darker and less thick on GameCube, most likely for ease of sight. While I do prefer the look of the original, which one is better just boils down to which you prefer, the looks or the accessibility. Big also wasn't replaced by anything in the ports, and there are more notes on the particle effects over the fans. And lastly, let's take a look at Mad Space, which does feature more than aesthetic differences for a change, even if it's largely similar to its original iteration. Most changes were made to the starting area though. The steel containers are in different positions in the ports, as the original had the switch to the capsule planet being the only not under one, while Battle changes it to the spherical planet. The Omochao that talks about the iron boots was moved from the rocket to the holy planet to the capsule planet. A gun hawk at the start was moved from the path right in front of the player to the one on the right. These two wooden containers on the capsule planet are placed much higher in the ports. The same happened to the solo container being much further away from the glass platform. The placement of this hint monitor on the same planet is also slightly different, with 9 more of those being present all throughout the level. Big was removed with nothing replacing him, and more rocks were added to the background as stage detail. The only difference between the hard modes is that this specific container in the Holy Planet has a different positioning. Finally, for character-specific stages, let's analyze Eggman's, whose levels constitute the ones that saw the most changes in the ports, as I've mentioned previously. Iron Gate, despite probably seeing more changes than all of Rouge's levels combined, is probably the one that saw the least of them compared to the others. Much like Prison Lane, more alarms, cameras, steam and gas canisters were placed throughout the level. However, the stage does feature huge downgrades made to its lighting, which are noticeable right from the spawn point. There's noticeably no ambience present, as the light blue fog was replaced by a murky grey one, as well as the blue character lighting being missing and replaced by a really generic one. This looks even worse on PC too. On the same note, the red alert sections use much more complex lighting on Dreamcast, with a red scanline effect that adjusts and reacts to the geometry's shape, while the GameCube has a barely noticeable siren spinning effect which doesn't really fit. This also makes the stage much darker and harder to navigate. 2 hovering gun hunters at the beginning of the level 5 section were replaced with regular versions. Big's cameo wasn't replaced with a ring, and the rest of the differences are mainly found in hard modes. In the room after the first checkpoint, there are 5 hunters on Dreamcast and a whopping 10 on GameCube. 3 hunters are now guarding the elevator in the ports, and the original game has level 3 and 4 security doors at the entrance and exit of the second elevator respectively, while the GameCube uses levels 4 and 5. Sand Ocean, on the other hand, did see a more significant number of changes. While they mostly have to do with various gun hawks around the stage, there are other noticeable differences. An example is that more breakable pots, columns, and gun flags were added to the environment to make it feel more alive. However, much like Tales' version of the level, most textures lost their details, and the hieroglyphs on the sandstone floors have really noticeable transparency issues on their borders. The skybox texture was also changed. The basic texture appears to be the same, however it's higher in resolution and adds stars to the sky, which is an undeniable improvement. A skyhawk present after the first rotating platform was swapped by an extra moving platform, as to make the section easier. A gun hawk was added just before the second breakable column. 3 breakable gas tanks were added just after said column in the ports. There are 3 moving platforms here instead of the 2 in the original. The enemies after the gold beetle were changed from chasing skyhawks to gunhawks. The checkpoint after those enemies is slightly further away from the edge of the platform on GameCube. An extra rhino was added near the last Chao container, as well as an absurd number of breakable vases. Past these, a gunhawk was added near the rotating spike balls. 2 extra gas tanks are now present in the area where you need to break them to reach a ledge after the last Chao box. 1 ring was also removed from this part. The GameCube version has 3 pillars with gun flags flanking either side of the platforms here. Contrary to the previous stage, Big's cameo was replaced with a single ring, which you can't collect. And near the final set of breakable columns is a pit with a weight trap. If you fall down here on the Dreamcast, you have to either hover out or jump on the weight to escape, while the ports had some stairs made of indestructible crates to make getting out a bit bit easier. Lost Colony also saw a fair number of changes, as many as Sand Ocean basically. This level was notorious for being one of the hardest to navigate, as it was really dark and thus a bit unfair at times. As such, the most noticeable difference is that the stage is significantly brighter on GameCube. It's also where Eggman's new flashlight in the ports becomes most apparent. The fog when the stage is lit up is less green and dense compared to the original. Some background pieces have a yellowish tint in the GameCube version, triangle decorations were added under the floors of some areas, the exterior areas have a bluish tint in the ports, distant geometry appears black on GameCube. While this fixes an issue with object rendering, it causes issues with the background as it remains the same brightness even though it's farther away. The red and yellow things on the tower at this exterior segment were also removed in battle. The hallway after this has a Hornet 3 enemy on Dreamcast, which was replaced with a 10-ring item box in the GameCube version. Speaking of rings, Big wasn't replaced by one in the ports. And lastly, after the long and slow lift sequence, some buggy collision in the original game lets you clip through a wall by hovering far enough to the right and then back. With proper positioning, it's then possible to clip into the Lost Chao room and end the level early. This was fixed in battle by adding an invisible wall that keeps you from reaching the hole in the collision. As for weapons pads, it has received some aesthetic upgrades and a small number of object tweaks. The ground texture for the carriers is lighter, and the texture that makes up the numbers has lost a lot of details in the transition. There's an extra row of inactive gun hunters at the start of the level. The background was changed in the GameCube version to fit better with the military harbor theming. The original game simply reused Metal Harbor skybox. Much like that stage, there's a blue fog that doesn't look too great in my opinion, even though it doesn't look as bad. On the Dreamcast, just after the first checkpoint is a group of 3 steel containers. The GameCube version increases this to 12. All carriers have seen the number of jets increased by 1 or 2 in battle. Towards the end of the level, there was a small, almost invisible gap where Eggman could fall through and die just before the spring platform. 2 mobile green containers were put here in the ports to prevent you from dying accidentally. The number of steel containers in front of the goal ring was also increased, from 2 to 4. Big wasn't replaced with anything in the ports. And as for hard modes, the number of jets that bomb your path when you leave the first carrier was increased from 3 to 4. The same change was made to the third carrier, adding another one for a total of 3 in the ports. And still in this area, 2 item boxes by the station jets were removed. And lastly, for Eggman stages, is probably the level that saw the most differences out of any in the game, Cosmic Wall. Generally, it's more difficult than the original game, featuring a ton of layout differences compared to the Dreamcast version. As is common for all other exterior arc levels, more asteroids, breakable signs and floating arrows were added around the stage, which in reality constitute the biggest part of the changes in this level. While probably not as noticeable as in other levels, some textures have had huge downgrades, specifically the floor direction arrows, where there's noticeable color banding and loss of detail in the texture's gradient. A spring was added in the platform below these 4 beetles, before the first interior climb. These 5 rings just before the last spring platform are also exclusive to SA2 Battle. The first interior climb swaps the 20-ring item box for a 10-ring one, and the red balloon containing 5 was added. The last 2 platforms before the pulley here also have no rings at all, with 6 in a vertical line and the red balloon being added in the ports. The exact same addition was made to the platforms after the 2 metal pyramids. The first interior fall has seen 1 more artificial chaos added, as well as a lot more green spinners. The 2 item boxes in the first on-rails ride give 20 rings and a health pack on Dreamcast, but were both changed to 10 rings in the ports. After this segment, the only metal pyramid is found on the platform above the Hornet. However, in the GameCube version, 2 metal pyramids were added next to the Hornet, with the old one being removed. And this platform that had no spring now has 1. The second big fall has 4 item boxes, all containing 20 rings in the original game, now having a setup of 5, 10, 10 and 20 ring boxes. The path to the second rail ride saw its brown spinner changed to green and an extra artificial chaos added. After turning left, there are 3 beetles, 1 spinner and 1 artificial chaos on the Dreamcast, with several more spinners, an extra beetle and another additional artificial chaos being present in battle. The item box just before the second interior climb is a health pack in the original game and 20 rings in the ports. Speaking of item boxes, set climbing section has no item box in this platform in the Dreamcast version, with a 5-ring one being added on GameCube. The beetle right in front of this platform also has a very slightly different position. Right after this beetle, a 5-ring balloon was added, and the spring on the next platform had its properties changed as to make it harder to immediately hit the wall spring, which could be used to skip the metal pyramid entirely. The beetle next to this platform had its positioning altered in the ports. A new platform was added next to the metal pyramid right after that beetle, and the green spinner in the same area is now placed above the yellow line. The item box you get by jumping on the spring was also changed from a health pack to 10 rings, as was the one next to the artificial chaos, originally giving 20 rings but now it only gives 10. A vertical line of 6 rings was also added. The item boxes right before the checkpoint at the start of the second rail ride are an extra life and a health pack in the Dreamcast version, being changed to 5 and 10 rings, and of course the health pack in this rail ride was changed to 20 rings. And Big wasn't replaced with anything in the GameCube version. All of those changes were for normal modes, as there are even more in hard modes. Right from the very start, the 10 ring item box was changed to a green shield, and there are now 7 green spinners around the artificial chaos instead of 3. In this area, the number of float type artificial chaos was increased from 1 to 3. There are now 3 pairs of spinning spike balls here instead of 1, as well as an additional green spinner. The number of beetles before the first checkpoint was increased from 5 to a whopping 12. And of course the health pack after this checkpoint was changed to nothing. It was simply removed. After this metal pyramid, 2 more artificial chaos enemies were added above the platform. Looking straight ahead, there's only a single beetle, with a brown spinner being added below it on GameCube. The artificial chaos trio saw 4 brown spinners added in the ports. The left Hornet 3 after this was exchanged for a Hornet 6. There are 3 beetles placed above this artificial chaos in the Dreamcast version, with 2 extra ones being added next to the metal pyramid in battle. The first climbing section has no beetles, and the item box has 20 rings in the original game, with 3 spark beetles being added and the ring box now only giving 10. The first fall only has a single float type artificial chaos on Dreamcast, being increased to 2, and 3 extra green spinners were added on top of the only one present in the original game. There's a 20 ring box before the first rail ride being downgraded to 10. The GameCube version adds 3 more artificial chaos during this segment. The health pack item box in this section was, you guessed it, changed, this time to a green shield. Along this turn, the number of artificial chaos was increased from 2 to 8. The GameCube added 1 more artificial chaos on the last straight. This is also a perfect example of SA2 Battle's bigger draw distance, as you can see these enemies from much further away, while in the Dreamcast version you don't have as much time to react to it. After the second big fall, there was an extra life which ended up being removed. Similarly to before, although this time on the right, the Hornet 3 was exchanged for a Hornet 6. The gunwing beetles are bugged in the Dreamcast version. The ones that move can't fire anything, and the left one that stays put has a fire particle coming out of the barrel, but nothing actually comes out of it. On GameCube, this was fixed and the moving ones do fire projectiles, however the left one will get frozen in place. This area saw the number of artificial chaos increased from 2 to 3, the item box on the meteor crossing gave an extra life originally, but in the ports it now gives 20 rings. The second climb had a regular beetle changed to its spark variant. Still in this area, the item box inside the metal pyramid was changed from giving 20 rings to simply 10. The first platform after the jump from the pulley has no rings to pick up on Dreamcast, with a vertical line of 6 being added in battle. The same sort of change was made in the last pulley platform, with a circle of 8 rings being added. The last item box was changed from a health pack to 20 rings, what a surprise, and the rank requirements to get an A rank are different in missions 1, 4 and 5. As you can probably tell by what I've been discussing over the past hour or so, there are a lot of changes made between the stages in Sonic Adventure 2 on the Dreamcast and SA2 Battle on the GameCube and the 2012 re-releases. While some characters have seen more tweaks to their stages than others, most differences have to do with the object layouts and additional detail in stages. But sadly, a lot of the changes made also include worse visuals as a result of toned-down lighting effects, transparency issues and blurry textures. But of course, there's credit to be given in what was improved. Even so, we're not finished yet, as you might have realized that there are still some areas of the game to cover. And you'd be right, as next we'll be taking a look at Canon's Core, DLC content having to do with Chao skins and kart races, finishing off with Chao World differences, with the latter system getting a huge revamp for the ports. However, we'll start with the first. Besides still being a level, every character goes through Canon's Core, and while I could have covered each character section in their own level differences, it's probably less confusing to have it covered individually. The other reason reason why I couldn't have covered it in the character-specific sections is that it barely features any differences at all, with the only ones being made to Rouge's, Knuckles' and Sonic's sections. Starting by Rouge, the wall light in this pit is displaying its materials wrongly and thus looks completely black. As for Knuckles, the difficulty in the laser room was toned down by removing some lasers and adding a green shield item box. The corners had no solid containers originally, which made taking the air bubbles a risk since the floor drags you down when you get close to it, being much safer in the ports due to the addition of the solid surfaces. As for Sonic, the enemy next to the time switch on the left ore area is now an artificial chaos instead of a gun hunter. The rotating cogs here were completely removed in the ports, probably to make what's in front of you easier to see. If you missed the gold ring in the Dreamcast version, you had to restart the level since there's no death plane placed below, meaning you can't die and thus are unable to retry from the last checkpoint. Battle adds a death plane, even though you can still see Sonic walk around perfectly fine, but you're now able to respawn at the last checkpoint. And hard mode adds an extra artificial chaos between these two doors. Also, all of Big's appearances in the level were replaced by a single ring. Now let's take a look at the downloadable content. The Dreamcast version allowed you to go into the Sonic Adventure 2 website and download stuff like the multiplayer skins, rare Chao types, menu themes and card courses to the Dreamcast's VMU. The Chao section had 3 specific subpages: the Chao Black Market, the Daycare and the BBS. The Black Market allowed you to download rare variants of Chao, most notably jewel types. Emblem trading is done by uploading your save file to the internet to verify if you have enough emblems to obtain a rare Chao. If you did, you'd be able to download the Chao to your VMU. These memory units had 200 blocks of storage. However, the downloadable types take up 128 blocks, over half of the total data shared by any game or save file you may have. Then you'd go into any Chao garden and use the Chao transporter to withdraw the downloaded Chao. On the other hand, you have the Chao Daycare, where you could upload your own Chao for other people to download, but nowadays it doesn't work. The BBS was simply a bulletin board. When it came to themes, you'd access the menu themes page to download exclusive character menus. All of these, including unreleased ones, were already inside the disk data itself, so the DLC files only acted as sort of keys to unlock them. This was changed on the GameCube by simply having all of them unlockable without requiring an internet connection. Similarly, the Halloween and Christmas costumes were also unlockable like this, which ended up being completely removed in the ports. As for the Kart DLC, you'd also download the specific tracks and karts online. However, all of the 3 kart tracks are exclusive to the Dreamcast version, and only 1 out of the 3 karts is exclusive to the original game. This kart is the Opa Opa kart, whose driver is Omochao. The Sonic kart can be unlocked by getting all A ranks in Sonic's levels, and the Egg Robo is unlocked by getting all A ranks in Rouge's stages. And lastly, for direct comparisons, let's take a look at Chao World. Much like SA1 and SADX, the jump from the original SA2 to SA2 Battle also saw a huge revamp made to the Chao system. Since SA2's port released first, the port of the first game ended up reusing the same system implemented here. However, many changes are exclusive to this version, especially regarding audio, the physical gardens themselves, as well as new or different content that didn't get implemented in Sonic Adventure DX. Let's start by audio differences, since there are less to cover. The Chao World lobby uses a completely original song for the Dreamcast version, where Omochao would greet you when you entered it. However, the GameCube version reuses Sonic Adventure's Chao Race entrance song and removes Omochao.
Welcome to Chao World!
The original Chao lobby music ended up getting reused for the Chao Stadium theme. While the Chao Race entrance theme isn't a reused song from SA1, it's still different compared to the one present in the Dreamcast. original song ended up being reused as the theme for the Chao transporter. And the Chao Kindergarten music keeps playing when you enter the classroom in the Dreamcast version, while the ports add new songs for this room, for a total of 6 different melodies. Also, leaving Chao World doesn't play the 16-bit warp sound effect in the GameCube, which is a lot less clean of a transition. The screen also fades to black instead of white. As I've mentioned before, the actual gardens themselves saw a number of differences made to them to reflect the change of platform. A result of that is the Chao Transporter, which now features a Game Boy Advance saying Chao Adventure, we'll get to that in a bit, instead of a VMU. Also, the original game featured a different transporter model for the different gardens in the game, which made it fit much better, while the GameCube version simply reuses the same model for all of them. Every Chao garden only had 2 permanent trees on the Dreamcast, while the ports increased it to 3. The Hero Garden is the one that saw the most changes made to its actual geometry though. It had a river and a bridge that ended up being removed, and the pond was much deeper originally, causing the infamous oversight where Tails could actually drown in it. Since the pond was made shallower, this can't happen anymore. It was also made bigger in size overall. The most notable feature of the original Dark Garden was the cliff with a cave underneath it, which ended up being replaced with a giant tree on GameCube. This was done to reduce the amount of time you take to search the area if you're trying to look for something, which also begs the question of what you prefer, quality of life/accessibility features or more detail. The pond was also made shallower here so Tails can't drown, and the cage wasn't solid at all on the Dreamcast, but its inside base has collision in the GameCube version, acting as a semi-platform of sorts. The Chao Kindergarten had its room layout completely changed in the ports, and also saw the addition of 2 extra ones, the Chao Black Market and the Fortune-Telling House. The former was added in-game to make up for the GameCube's lack of native Ethernet support. Yes, I know there's an adapter, but that's not native, stop spamming my comments with that. And now sells you stuff like fruits and toys that can't be obtained normally. And the bulletin board had its text changed because the GameCube doesn't have a built-in browser. It simply gives you the link to go to the Chao homepage on another device. In the original game, you could attack with any character without any restrictions, despite the game lying and telling you that the action button is for whistling. However, the GameCube version makes it so that you have to press the Y button to switch between whistling and attacking for any character that isn't Sonic or Shadow, with these two seeing their attacks completely removed from the gardens. Sonic Adventure 2 Battle also had several new types of Chao, being the Monotone Chao, 5 additional types of Dual Chao, although getting all of them requires a GBA connection by using the tiny Chao Garden. We'll get to it in a moment, I promise, since the original 6 types were only accessible via an online download. However, the Moon Chao was completely removed from the ports. There are also Shiny Chao variants, and 3 new character Chao, Tails, Knuckles and Amy. Tails is obtainable if you have Phantasy Star Online or the Japanese e-catalog from summer 2003, as well as a GBA connection, while the other 2 are accessible through the exact same means excluding PSO, although you do need to have a GBA connection to the Japanese version of either SADX or SA2 Battle. Now let's actually get to the minigames. The Dreamcast version featured a Chao minigame on the VMU called Chao Adventure 2. You'd have to go to the transporter and place your Chao on there, which fills up more than half the storage by the way, and then you'd be able to start the minigame directly on the memory unit. It was the only legit way for Dreamcast users to view the Chao stats, add a nickname, boost intelligence or luck stats, as well as obtain rare fruits and seeds. You could also breed 2 Chao together from different VMUs by connecting them together. Along the journey, your Chao would meet random characters which would give it a unique fruit. At the end of it, the Chao can obtain a seed to be planted in the Chao garden. Then you'd have to select your VMU, pick up your Chao, as well as every item it found during their adventure. If you're familiar with the ports though, you already know that this works very differently. Firstly, as I've mentioned before, getting rare fruits and items is all done in-game via the Black Market set in the Chao Kindergarten, which can be bought with rings you collected in the action stages. Giving nicknames to your Chao is also done via the fortune-telling house. Boosting luck on Dreamcast was done by guessing correctly what was inside the treasure chest when the Chao found one. Guess it correctly and it gains 100 luck points. Guess it incorrectly and it loses 100 luck points. Intelligence, on the other hand, was boosted by giving the Chao purple fruits. In the GameCube, both stats can be increased by simply feeding it chaos drives or some specific animals. These are completely wiped out of your garden when you leave it in the Dreamcast version, but stay where you left them on GameCube. You can also see the Chao stats directly in-game by simply picking them up. The tiny Chao garden is basically Chao Adventure 2 for the GBA, if you had either Sonic Advance 2, or Sonic Pinball Party, although much better. It has music, colored graphics, and much more interaction compared to the original. Generally, the new one has better incentives for all of the non-random event minigames, where you basically earn rings to buy more items in-game. CA2's non-random event minigame is a literal slot machine, used to earn fruits and doesn't boost stats at all. You'd retrieve these items in the same way you do in the Dreamcast. Go to a transporter, connect the GBA, and pick up the items and the Chao. On the same note, the transporter has the exclusive feature in the ports of being able to release unwanted Chao. New features were added to the Chao Doctor, namely a win-loss record and a stats grading system. The Dreamcast also had a bug that would crash your game when a specific text related to reincarnated Chao appears. Speaking of reincarnations, on the Dreamcast, a reincarnated Chao would be born with all of its stats set to 0, while the GameCube sets them all to level 1 and a bit. The biggest Chao exclusive feature to SA2 Battle is, of course, Chao Karate. There's not much to talk about it since it didn't exist originally, but it's there for those who want it. Chao Race also has a few differences compared to the original. The player count was dropped from 8, which was done by having 2 players per controller, to 4. In the Dreamcast version, one player would hit the right trigger to cheer and the other the left trigger. The GameCube situation is a product of the cheer button being remapped to the A button and not any of the 2 triggers. Only the Dreamcast version displays the Chao's name in the initial shot where every Chao in the race is shown, and the cheer noise is different. Before I forget, and even though I didn't say I'd cover it, the boss stages have very slight differences, and only a select few have them, so this'll be quick. The ads in the Bigfoot stage underwent the same changes as the one in City Escape, as the Phantasy Star Online billboard was given a different design. Benches and trash cans were also added to the scenery. The first Eggman vs Tails fight was given the same new background as Weapons Bed, but it lacks a lot of lighting in the GameCube version, looking darker. The fog in the first Sonic vs Shadow battle was removed from the ports, looking arguably worse now. The lighting for the Flying Dog stage is less red on GameCube and lacks the same flowing light effect as Headquarters. The second Eggman vs Tails fight has a black plane added on top of it in battle to prevent the space background from showing above the stage at certain angles. The Earth also lacks its glowing effect both in the previous fight and in the second Sonic vs Shadow fight in the GameCube version, and the Earth is closer to the Ark in the GameCube's final hazards. While Sonic Adventure 2 Battle really does enhance some parts of the game comparatively to what Sonic Adventure DX did to its original version 2 years later, there are still a lot of issues that can't be overlooked. Sure, the ports add a ton of new features like Chao Karate, a completely revamped multiplayer modes and new detailed models, as well as quality of life additions such as 60 FPS gameplay, bug fixes, and simplified level design / geometry in most instances. However, for me personally at least, while I do like most of the changes introduced by SA2 Battle, and would honestly rather play the ports than the original game, in opposition to how I feel about SA1 and SADX, the much lower quality textures, downgraded shaders and lighting, as well as the transparency / layering issues that plague the game are a testament to how much more polish the game needed. Because some examples of these problems are pretty much unforgivable considering the company that published them. Sure, it was the first Sonic game for the GameCube, meaning they were still adjusting at that point, but all of the issues that the game has could have been fixed if enough attention was put into them. Not every single game on GameCube has blurry textures and transparency issues. Sure, the original SA2 relied a lot on the Dreamcast's technology and hardware, but everything could have looked just as good, if not even better, if Sonic Team had taken the time to properly port everything correctly. Even some of the improvements, such as 60 FPS, create their own share of problems, especially when talking about cutscenes, where the characters talk over each other and their lines don't really sync up with their mouths and movements. Hell, it's in these cutscenes that every graphical issue becomes the most apparent, so there's simply no way these issues went unnoticed. Either there wasn't enough time or budget to fix them, or it wasn't a priority, which in hindsight it probably should have. Even if these features do come as and really are legitimate attempts to improve the game, contrary to SADX, it's impossible to recommend a definitive version of the game, because some changes are purely subjective in their quality, such as different level designs and style changes, as well as all the other issues that the ports themselves have, which might be a deal breaker to some people despite all the other enhancements. As so, I'll try to recommend the best version of the game to play depending on which sort of experience you're looking for. The first question that may come to your mind might be, is it possible to combine all of the benefits of the Dreamcast version and the GameCube into one? Why, yes there is. While SADX does have an installer that pretty much combines every benefit of its original form and the ports into one, SA2 doesn't really have an equivalent of that, but it does have a few mods that fix the PC version's issues, which are mostly identical to the GameCube. The first one I recommend is the SA2 Render Fix mod by Aquatic, fixing many graphical issues such as the environment maps, the tint of the models, disabling the messed up global index, and much more. Another one I absolutely recommend is Cutscene Revamp by Speep's Highway, which basically fixes every single major issue of SA2 Battles cutscenes that I covered earlier in the video, lighting and transparency issues too. Another mod best combined with this is Sound Fix for cutscenes by CoVip37, which fixes the issue with the characters interrupting themselves, so definitely check both out. Other mods you should download that fix minor things include Level Oddity Patch by En Passant, fixing inconsistencies such as levels without gold beetles, out of bounds rings, and other weird stuff such as typos. SA2 Input Controls by Aquatic, which fixes the problem with the PC version of the very aggressive dead zone that doesn't let you balance on rails properly. HD GUI for SA2 also by Speep's Highway, which replaces some of the low quality UI graphics that didn't get properly upscaled during the porting process. Reworked After Images by End User, which fixes some issues with the after images, as well as restores Shadow's unused one and adds it to the multiplayer exclusive characters. Tikal's Stance Fix by Jake the Silent, which fixes Tikal's weird stance. And lastly, Rouge's eye animation fix by Sonen10, fixing the issue with Rouge's left eye rotating when climbing left for some reason. Then, which version of Sonic Adventure 2 should you play? Well, while what I just said might make the answer pretty obvious, it depends on what your objective with this game is, with all of them being important to consider. Of course, if you want the best experience possible, then the Sonic Adventure 2 Steam version with the mods I just mentioned is definitely the best way to go. The first point I want to touch on is portability. If you want to carry Sonic Adventure 2 around and play it on the go everywhere, then the Dreamcast version will be the most accessible and easiest to run on most devices, whether you run it on a PS Vita, on your phone, or on any other emulation handhelds. This is especially fun since you even get a portable Chao Garden. However, if you have a more powerful handheld like a Steam Deck or an ROG Ally, then playing the Steam version with those mods is also the best solution. While setting it up on SteamOS might be a bit difficult, there's a great tutorial for it online, which I'll link in the description, so if it interests you, check it out. If you want the most faithful experience, then it depends on which exact experience you want. If you want to experience SA2 as it was on the Dreamcast, then get yourself that console and play it on a CRT. As for SA2 Battle, if you're gonna run it as vanilla as possible, then the GameCube version on the console directly or on a Wii is gonna be your best bet, as I don't really recommend running the base PC version with no mods. You can always emulate the Dreamcast game on PC and activate a widescreen hack to get a 16:9 widescreen aspect ratio, or do the same thing but for SA2 Battle, which is easier to run out of the box and will probably be more satisfying to most people. The worst experience possible is definitely the stock Steam version at like 10 FPS, but I don't know why you'd want to do that to yourself. That version doesn't run correctly out of the box too. You have to limit the frame rate in the launcher, otherwise it'll run at like 10 times the normal speeds. Sonic Adventure 2 Battle is commonly referred to as an enhanced version of the original game. However, as we've seen throughout the video, it'd be more accurate to call it an expansion over anything else. While the ports of the Dreamcast version don't do that terrible of a job trying to mimic the feel of the original, there's a lot of stuff that is worse and that sometimes even overshadows the goods that the new versions add. These ports are a double-edged sword. Every time you try to analyze something, there's both an improvement and a downgrade in some way. While it was easy to complain about SADX due to its serious downgrading every single aspect of its original version, SA2 Battle just leaves me confused, because I don't know if I should praise it for the good it does, or criticize it for the very bad it also does. The best balance I can find is doing both, which is better than nothing. I don't feel as strongly about SA2 as I do about any other game really, so I don't have much to add in comparison, but I can't help but feel like a lot better could have been done, and considering how Sonic Adventure DX is and how much it changes stuff, Sonic Team probably felt the same way too, but stuff didn't didn't turn out as intended. And I can't believe I have to make this clear, but don't interpret this video as me hating or looking down on those that prefer the ports over the original game. I had a lot of people complaining about this in my SA1 versus SADX comparison video, like I'm criticizing whoever disagrees with my opinion or something. There were even some that criticized me for giving my opinion on these changes and not simply showing them. Guys, I don't care which version you prefer as long as you enjoy the game. I'm not here to tell you which version you should really play or which version you should prefer because the other one is horrible. I'm one of those people that truly believes that a game is so much better when there isn't an annoying person telling you it sucks, which isn't the point of the video. My real objective is, yes, showing in an informative manner the differences between both versions, but there's no way I can do it without giving my own input on it, especially if I feel emotionally attached to it like I do with SA1. At the end of the day, the message of these videos is that you should just enjoy what you do enjoy without anyone changing your opinion about it, because once you do let other people dictate your tastes, then you truly won't enjoy anything at all. But yeah, I guess that's about it for this video. Once again, if you found anything wrong in the video, feel free to correct me in the comments. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications, as these videos take a lot of effort to make. You can also support me on Patreon or through YouTube memberships to get early access to videos and your name in the screen at the end, as well as follow me on Twitter if you want, and check out my community tab once in a while where I post quite frequently with video news. And that's it really. I'll hopefully see you soon.